Jake Mercer was 22 years old and had a strange obsession. He spent his evenings exploring Google Maps. Not to find places to visit, to find errors. Anomalies. Things that didn't add up. Roads that ended in nothing. Nameless buildings. Coordinates that pointed to empty fields with a precise address, and a 5-star review left by an account created the day before. He never told anyone. He didn't even have a name for what he did. It was just something he couldn't stop doing. Dalton Creek appeared on Google Maps, complete with streets, blocks, a post office, a diner called Henny's, and a small Baptist church with no photographs. No website, no mention on Yelp, no results on Google News, no record in the United States Census Bureau database. A town of 400 people that, as far as the federal government was concerned, did not exist, and Jake wanted to know why. Ryan Castillo was his college roommate, the kind of person who always found a rational explanation for everything. When Jake showed him Dalton Creek on the laptop, Ryan looked at it for 30 seconds, then said, "Data Becerra, it happens." Wrong coordinates get sent, and a digital ghost town shows up. Jake shook his head. He said, "Look at the shadows on the buildings. They're consistent with the sun's position. These satellite images are real." Ryan said nothing. It was November 2019, Thanksgiving break, 5 days off, no exams, no obligations. Jake had already told his family he was staying at college. Ryan had done the same. Neither of them felt like driving 4 hours to eat turkey with relatives. Jake suggested going to Dalton Creek instead, 300 kilometers. 1 day there, 1 day back. Just to see. Ryan said no for 40 minutes. Then he picked up his Ford Focus keys. What they found there was something neither of them could explain. Something Ryan never told anyone until he was forced to. They left early in the morning. Ryan drove. Jake held his phone, checking the directions every 5 minutes. For the first 2 hours, everything was normal. Highway, then state roads, then secondary roads, growing narrower and narrower. At some point, Google Maps told them to turn onto an unpaved road. Dirt track. Cornfields on both sides. No signs. Ryan slowed down. He asked Jake if he was sure about the road. Jake checked his phone. He said, "Yes, we're 12 minutes away." Ryan didn't answer. He kept driving. Then, around a wide bend, Dalton Creek appeared. The first thing that struck Jake was the absence of sound, not the silence of the countryside, which always has something: wind, insects, birds. This was different. It was a constructed silence. Artificial. As if someone had turned down the volume on the world. The streets were clean. The lawns well kept. The houses freshly painted. Everything was in order. Everything except one thing. There was no one. No people on the sidewalks. No cars in the driveways. No dogs in the yards. No open windows. No visible television glow from outside. Ryan parked in the middle of the main street and switched off the engine. The silence that followed was so heavy that Jake described the feeling as having cotton wool stuffed in his ears, as if the town were holding its breath. Ryan said, "Let's get out and look around. 5 minutes, then we leave." Jake nodded, but those 5 minutes became something very different. Henny's Diner was the only place with the lights on. A small neon sign in the corner of the window. Open red, pulsing slowly. The door was ajar. They went in. On the counter, there were 4 cups of coffee. Jake touched them one by one, warm, as if someone had poured them 3 minutes earlier. The kitchen in the back was on. There was the sound of something cooking. Ryan walked up to the kitchen entrance and looked inside. Nobody, but a pan on the burner, with hot oil frying in the empty room. Jake was about to say they had to leave. Then he saw the television in the corner. It was an old cathode ray television, mounted high in the corner of the diner, above the register. It was broadcasting black and white footage, high-angle shots, grainy, like a security camera. It took Jake a few seconds to understand what he was looking at. It was their car, Ryan's Ford Focus, shot from above by a camera somewhere on the main street. The footage showed their Ford entering Dalton Creek with a time stamp in the bottom corner showing the time. 32 minutes earlier. Ryan said, "There's a surveillance camera. It's normal. Every town has cameras." Jake didn't answer. He was watching the screen. Because the camera was moving, slowly, it was rotating toward the diner. Toward them, and then it framed them through the window from outside. At that exact moment, while they stood there, frozen, watching the screen, Ryan said one word. "Let's go." And it was the first time all day that Jake didn't argue. They left the diner quickly. They didn't run. Jake made a point of saying this in every version of the story. They didn't run because running would have meant admitting they were afraid. And admitting they were afraid meant admitting there was something to be afraid of. They walked fast. Got in the car. Ryan started the engine. As they drove out of town, Jake looked through the window at the houses passing by. And for the first time he noticed something he hadn't seen on the way in. The curtains. Every house had its curtains drawn. Every window was covered. But in some, only in some, there was light leaking through the edges, as if someone was inside, in the dark, waiting. Jake didn't tell Ryan. He didn't say anything because in that same moment, he saw something else. Something he has never fully described even to me. He only said, there was movement. Behind the curtains, they drove for an hour without stopping. Ryan kept his eyes fixed on the road. Jake watched his phone. At some point, Jake opened Google Maps to find the way back. He searched for Dalton Creek. It wasn't there. It no longer appeared. No results. Jake tried the full name. Then the coordinates he had saved that morning. The coordinates pointed to an empty field. No name, no roads, nothing. As if Dalton Creek had never existed. Ryan said it was a network problem. Jake didn't answer. He opened the browser and searched Dalton Creek on Google. No results. He searched Henny's Diner, Kansas. No results. He searched the name of the main street they had walked down. No results. No trace. Anywhere. As if they had been the only human beings who knew the town existed. But 3 weeks later, Jake received something that proved otherwise. An envelope. No sender. No stamp. Which was already, in itself, impossible. It was simply in his mailbox. As if someone had placed it there by hand. Inside was a photograph. Real photographic paper. Not a computer printout. Black and white. Heavy grain. Like surveillance footage. It was them, Jake and Ryan. Shot from outside the diner, through the window, while they looked up at the television. Someone had been outside. Someone had watched them. Someone had taken that photograph while they were inside, convinced they were alone. Jake turned the photograph over. On the back, written by hand in black ink, in precise block letters, it read, "You will come back." It wasn't a question. It wasn't an invitation. It was a certainty. Jake never went back to Dalton Creek. He never tried to find the town again. That same evening, he took the photograph, tore it into 4 pieces and threw it in the kitchen bin. He covered it with coffee grounds. He put a paper towel over it. Then he went to sleep. And the next morning, he woke up at 6. He went to the kitchen to make coffee. The photograph was on the table. Not torn. Folded in 4, exactly as it had been when he found it in the envelope. Jake stood motionless in the middle of the kitchen for a length of time he couldn't measure. Then he opened the bin again. The coffee grounds were still there. The paper towel was still there. The 4 pieces were not. Jake never spoke of this to anyone for 4 years. Until a woman knocked on his door with questions, and what she told him changed the way he understood everything, including the gray sedan parked outside his apartment. 4 years had passed. Jake was 26, living alone in Lawrence, Kansas. The irony was not lost on him, and he had never touched Google Maps again to explore unknown places. He worked at a call center, quiet life, fixed routine. Then, one November evening, someone knocked at the door. It was a woman, around 40, dark hair, gray jacket. She showed him a badge. Private investigator. She worked for a client who preferred to remain anonymous. She said she was collecting testimonies about Dalton Creek. Jake stood frozen in the doorway. He had never told anyone the name of that town. The woman looked at him and said, "I know, you've never talked about it. That's why I'm here. Because you're one of the few people who went in and came back out." Jake asked how many others there were. She said, "Very few." And then she added something Jake hadn't expected. The woman came in, sat down, and told him what she had discovered in 2 years of investigation. Dalton Creek had been a real town. It had genuinely existed until the late 1980s. Then it was abandoned, struck from the records, removed from official maps. But someone had continued to maintain it. Freshly paved roads, manicured lawns, painted houses, Henny's diner with its neon sign on and warm cups of coffee on the counter. Who was unclear. The land was registered to a shell company with no traceable employees and no verifiable physical address. The woman opened a folder. She showed Jake a list. 17 names. People who had found Dalton Creek between 2015 and 2019 and had gone there. Jake was number 15. Of the 17, 14 had come back. 3 had not. Jake asked what had happened to the 3. The woman was silent for a few seconds. Then she said, "That's the part I'm still working on." The woman left after an hour. She gave Jake a phone number written on a plain white business card with no name on it. Jake called that number 2 days later. No one answered. He called again, a week later, out of service. He never found out who that woman was. He never found out who had paid for the investigation. He never found out what had happened to the 3 missing people. He only knows one thing. That evening, after the woman left, Jake went to the window of his apartment in Lawrence. Across the street, there was a parked car. A gray sedan, engined off, windows slightly open. There was someone inside. Still. Looking up, Jake went down the stairs and out onto the sidewalk. The sedan was the woman's. He recognized it by the license plate, but when he reached the window, the car was empty, engine cold. As if it had been parked there for hours. I saw a figure. Then I went down, and there was no one. You've just heard is a story about something that refuses to be ignored. About something that knows when you're looking for it, and knows where to find you afterward. The story you're about to hear is different in setting, different in characters, different in everything, except one thing. In this story too, there is someone who watches, and something that watches back. Virginia, 1997. This time there is no town to find on a map. There is only a window, and a child who should never have been there. Sandra Hollis was 42 years old and was starting over. The divorce had been finalized in August. The house in Richmond, the big one, with the double garage in the backyard, had gone to her ex-husband. She had taken her suitcases, her books, and her border-colored Volvo. In September, she had signed a rental contract for a house in Millbrook, a small town north of Charlottesville. Residential neighborhood, quiet neighbors, everything she needed to stop thinking. The house was nice. Red brick, front porch, 3 rooms. The living room had a large window that looked out onto the street. On the first day, Sandra placed an armchair in front of that window. In the evenings, she would sit there with a book and watch the empty street. She liked the fact that no one ever walked by. She liked the silence, or at least, that's what she believed. It was a Thursday evening in late September. Sandra was reading in the armchair. It was around 9 o'clock. She looked up from the book for a moment, one of those instants when your gaze moves for no reason, as if something pulls it. On the sidewalk across the street there was a child. Sandra looked at him for a few seconds. Then she thought it must be lost, or waiting for someone. She looked back down at the book. When she looked up again 5 minutes later, the child was still there. Same exact spot. Same posture. Sandra closed the curtains and went to bed. She thought that the next day she would ask the neighbors if they had seen anything. She wouldn't need to. The second evening, Sandra was back in the armchair. It was 9:15. Before opening the book, she opened the curtains and looked outside. She would never normally have done this, but something made her. The child was there. Same spot on the sidewalk. Same dark coat. Same way of standing motionless. Arms at his sides, head tilted slightly up toward the window. Sandra stared at him for a long moment. Then, she went out onto the porch. "Hey!" Her voice came out lower than she expected. She cleared her throat. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" The child didn't answer. He didn't move. Sandra took a step forward. The child turned his head to the left, looking away as if he had heard a sound from the street. Then, just as Sandra was about to step off the porch, he turned back toward her and waited. Sandra went back inside. She locked the door. For the first time since she had moved in, she also turned the deadbolt. It went on for 13 consecutive nights, always at the same time, between 9 in the evening and 11, never earlier, never later. Like a work shift, Sandra started keeping a diary. Not out of fear, she told herself, but out of habit. She wrote down the time he appeared, how long he stayed, whether he moved. On the fourth night, Sandra knocked on the window glass. The child didn't react. On the sixth night, Sandra turned the living room light on and off 3 times. No reaction. On the seventh night, Sandra called the police. An officer came by, looked around, found no one. The child had left 30 seconds before the police car turned into the block. On the 8th night, Sandra decided to do something different. Not at night, not in a panic. She waited for the weekend. She wanted to seem calm. She wanted to seem like someone with a normal question. She went to the neighbors on a Sunday afternoon. The Caldwells lived next door. Dennis and Margaret, around 60. Kind, discreet. The kind of neighbors who bring a cake when you move in. Sandra rang the doorbell. Margaret answered, invited her in, offered her coffee. Sandra described the child, the dark coat, the straight hair, the way he stood motionless. Margaret listened in silence. Then she called Dennis from the next room. Dennis came in, heard the description, looked at his wife. Margaret said, Sandra, we're sorry. We don't know who you're talking about. And then she added one thing. We have never had children, and there are no young children in this block. Sandra thanked them, said goodbye, and went home. That evening, she didn't open the curtains. Not opening them didn't help. On the 9th night, Sandra heard a noise on the porch, not a knock. Something lighter, like a weight shifting on a wooden plank, like someone moving closer, slowly. It was 3 in the morning. Sandra was awake. She hadn't been able to sleep for 2 nights. She walked up to the living room window and moved the curtain 1 centimeter, just 1 centimeter. The child was on the porch, less than a meter from the glass. He was looking at her, and for the first time in 9 nights, he was smiling. Sandra didn't move. She didn't call the police. She didn't scream. She stood still, holding the curtain, and waited. And this, she said, was the hardest thing she had ever done in her life. The next day, Sandra called her lawyer and asked to break the rental contract. The lawyer explained she would lose 2 months' deposit. Sandra said that was fine. In the meantime, she called the police again. This time a detective came, a man in his 50s, practical, skeptical. Sandra showed him the diary. The detective read it, took notes, and said they would investigate. 3 days later, the detective called her back. They had checked to the district school records. No missing child matched the description. They had questioned all the residents of the block. No one had ever seen the child Sandra described. The detective said perhaps it was a neighborhood child, playing outside late. He said they would continue to keep an eye on the area. Sandra thanked him. She hung up. She already knew she would never sleep in that house again. But before she left, one last thing happened, something that completely changed the way Sandra understood everything she had been through. It was the 7th consecutive night Sandra couldn't sleep. It was past 2 in the morning and she was sitting in the kitchen with all the lights on, every light, including the hallway, staring at the wall. At some point she got up. She didn't quite know why. She opened the basement door and went down. She'd never been down there in all those months. She had no reason to, but that night she needed to move, to do something with her hands, to not stand still. In a corner, behind an empty metal shelving unit, there was a cardboard box. Sandra moved it, assuming it had been left by the previous tenant. Inside were photographs, old ones, 1970s, perhaps, family photos, a young couple, a house that looked like Sandra's, a child. Sandra flipped through them quickly, then she stopped. The photograph showed that same window. Her window shot from outside, and inside, there was a woman sitting in an armchair, her back to the camera, holding a book. Sandra turned the photograph over. On the back, written in pencil and a child's handwriting, it read, "The lady by the window, October 1974, that woman was not Sandra." The photograph was 23 years old, but the armchair was the same. The position was the same, and the child, evidently, had started long before. Sandra left Millbrook in November. She moved to Richmond, to an apartment on the 5th floor with no external staircases. She didn't give anyone her new address for the first 3 months. Then, in January, she received a phone call. Unknown number.
She answered. It was a man.
He said his name was Paul Garrett. He said he had rented the house in Millbrook, her former house, from the 1st of December. He said, "I'm sorry to bother you. I know this is strange, but I wanted to ask you something. There's a child who stops in front of the living room window every evening. Is he a neighborhood kid? Do you know whose he is?" Sandra said nothing. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She didn't say, "Call the police." She didn't say, "Move out." She didn't say, "Be careful." She stayed silent for a few seconds. Then she hung up. Paul Garrett called back twice. Sandra didn't answer. She blocked the number, not because she was cruel, not because she didn't want to help him, but because she didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to explain something she herself couldn't explain. She didn't know if telling him the truth would have changed anything, because the most frightening thing wasn't the child. It was what Sandra had understood when she looked at that photograph in the basement. The child in the 1974 photograph was the same child Sandra had seen on the sidewalk in 1997. Not similar. Not identical. The same height, same dark coat, same straight hair, same posture. Arms at his sides, head slightly raised. 23 years. The same house, the same window, the same child. Sandra had never known who lived in that house before her. She knew nothing about the couple in the photograph. She didn't know if they too had called the police, kept a diary, lost sleep. She didn't know if they too had found a box in the basement with even older photographs. She didn't know how far back it all went. And this is the most frightening part. Not the child. Not the smile. The fact that it had evidently been going on for a very, very long time, and that no one had ever found an answer. Sandra Hollis never went back to Millbrook. Paul Garrett left the house after 2 months. The landlord struggled to rent it out again. The house is still there. The red brick, the porch, the large living room window. And every now and then, the neighbors say, you can still see him. A child on the sidewalk in the evening, motionless, looking in. Don't ask yourself who the child is. Ask yourself why he chooses that window. 2 stories. 2 unanswered questions. A town in Kansas that only exists when it wants to be found and knows exactly when you are there. A child in Virginia who was there before you were born and will still be there after you are gone. No explanation. If you want to hear more stories like these, subscribe to the channel for more. And if you made it this far, sleeping tonight is your problem.